Hello, everyone, and welcome to the second edition of the Old Europe podcast, the podcast in which I talk about history related topics which interest me. So today I'm going to be talking about, as I announced in the previous episode, today I'm going to be talking about sports in the ancient world and the ancient Olympics. However, to introduce the topic, I'm not going to be talking about, I'm not going to give you like a chronology of the ancient Olympics, and I'm not going to talk about, what happened in which year and where the ancient Olympics originate from and, topics like that, because frankly, you can just go to Wikipedia and learn that. Plus, in my research, I found quite a few videos on YouTube on the topic that were quite good. So I don't really feel like I can add much to that discussion. So instead, what this video is going to be is it's going to be a little bit more of a philosophical discussion of the attitudes towards sports of the ancient Greeks, how sport was perceived, and there are also quite a few differences between modern sports and ancient sports that I want to talk about. So yeah, the main thing that I'm going to talk about is how the ancient Greeks perceived sport. I'm going to be talking about the ancient Olympics in terms of the things about them that I found interesting. I'm going to discuss the sports in the ancient Olympics, but there are some important points that I want to make. And most importantly, towards the end of the episode, I want to talk about how the different how sports were perceived in the ancient world, in particular by the ancient Greeks, and how they're perceived today. Okay, so let's get into it. I'm gonna start this topic a little bit. I'm gonna start from far away. I'm not gonna get into the topic right away because there is a point that I want to make, and there is a personal anecdote that I want to share that is related to the topic. I'm gonna get to it, I promise. So I don't know if you can hear it, but my voice probably sounds a little bit different than it usually does. And the reason for that is that right after I recorded my last video, I got the thing that's been going around the world for the past 3 years that I can't name because even by saying the word, my video could get flagged on YouTube. So I gotta mind my language, but obviously you know what I'm talking about. Anyway, I got that thing, and I got some lingering symptoms from it, and the main one was that my voice just wouldn't come back. My voice was changed, and until the start of this week, it was in pretty rough shape. So I couldn't really record any videos because of that. But that's a little bit besides the point. Overall, the whole experience, while it was unpleasant, it wasn't really that bad. I wasn't feeling too well for a few days. I was out of order. I couldn't really do much, but it passed fairly quickly, and I recovered. I wouldn't say it was very difficult. And one of the reasons why I believe this to be the case, in fact, I believe this to be the main reason for why things turned out this way, is because I'm in very good physical shape. So I haven't mentioned this on the channel before, but I'm actually a competitive athlete, and as such, I believe that it is my responsibility to stay in shape throughout the year. And so as a result, I look after my health, and I'm pretty healthy, and I'm physically fit. And here's how I'm gonna relate this anecdote to the ancient Greeks. So, ancient Greeks were very big on athletics in general, and they were very big on competitive sports, and obviously they were the ones who, the first ancient Olympics were in ancient Greeks, and they were essentially the ones who came up with a concept of competitive sport. However, it wasn't just sport. It wasn't just competitive sport that was so revered in ancient Greece, but it was physical fitness in general. And I think that there is a lot that we can learn from the ancient Greeks in this regard. Unfortunately, nowadays, people view mental health and physical health as separate things. And you have a lot of people who have jobs that are that require them to be very mentally sharp, and they try to be mentally sharp, they try to perform well in their jobs, but they're not physically fit. In the modern world, it's pretty obvious. In the West in particular, there is a very severe obesity problem because people are not taking their physical health very seriously. And but back to my point, there are a lot of people who try to be mentally sharp and they try to perform well in their job, but they don't take care of their physical health, of their actual health. And I think that that's a notion that the ancient Greeks would disagree with, because they viewed the mind and the body as one and the same. And that's one of the reasons why the Greeks took physical fitness so seriously, is because they believe that if you are physically fit, you are going to perform better in all kinds of aspects. Like it wasn't just like if you're physically fit, you can be a better soldier or you can be a better athlete, but you could also be a better philosopher. And that is something that was very popular among ancient Greek philosophers, is that they worked out, they lifted weights, and they try to be in as good of a physical shape as possible. In fact, there is a very good quote which I want to read to you. It is a quote by Socrates, and it is the following: "No man has the right to be an amateur in the matter of physical training. It is a shame for a man to grow old without seeing the beauty and strength of which his body is capable." And I think that this quote really well summarizes the ancient Greek attitude towards physical fitness, and why they saw sport as something that was so important. Of course, I'm sure that there are going to be some people who are going to disagree. And in particular, for example, while I was doing research for this video, one of the articles that I read stated that the Greeks held sport in such a high regard because they saw it as something civilized, as something that the barbarians didn't do, and because they did it, that they saw themselves as superior to them. And I'm sure that this is the case. I'm sure that they saw sport as something civilized, because it is true that the Greeks were they were essentially the first civilization which, developed competitive sport and that engaged in it. But I'm sure that they also realized just the benefits of being physically fit, and that's also another reason why they held it in such a high regard. And that's a point that is very important to me, because I think that a lot of modern people are just oblivious to this kind of concept. And that's why I wanted to talk about it in the start of this video, because if you're not familiar with this concept, you can greatly benefit from just familiarizing yourself with it. And I think that in this aspect in particular, everyone can benefit by being like the ancient Greeks. So I would encourage you to try it. If you're someone who is not physically fit, who doesn't work out, who doesn't do any kind of sport in general, I think that you can greatly benefit from going to the gym or exercising in some kind of way. So I guess to summarize, be like the ancient Greeks. And it's not something that is very difficult, because in order to be physically fit, you don't have to be a competitive athlete. In fact, if you want to be an athlete at a very high level, you can make an argument that that's not really the healthiest thing. But being in good physical shape and being a competitive athlete, those are two very different things. You don't have to be a professional athlete to be in shape. So yeah, I view it as like a basic skill that people should have, and I think that that's also how the ancient Greeks viewed it. So yeah, I wanted to make this point just to encourage people who don't work out to do it, because you can only benefit from it. Anyway, let's go to the next point, in which I want to talk about the ancient Olympics, and I want to go through some of the sports and once again make some points about them, describe them to you, and tell you what I personally find interesting about them. Okay, so here I have a list of some of the sports which were a part of the Olympic Games throughout the years. And so when I talk about these sports, I'm talking about the Olympics because, sports over the years changed quite drastically. And that's something that keeps happening in the modern Olympics. There's for every Olympic Games, there is a different list of sports that are included in it. For example, in the next Olympic Games, I think they're adding skateboarding as a sport. That's like a new sport which will become an Olympic discipline, which, I mean, it's kind of weird, but regardless. So yeah, sports came and went throughout the years, but when I'm talking about these sports, I'm talking about pre Greco-Persian invasion Greece, pre-Peloponnesian War, pre Greco-Persian War. So we're talking about 5th century and 5th century BC and before that. So one of the most popular sports in the ancient Olympics was the pentathlon. So this was a multidisciplinary sport. So pentathlon basically means that it's a combination of 5 different disciplines. So penta is the Greek word for 5. So therefore it combines 5 different disciplines. Now I can't tell you exactly which those disciplines were because again they changed throughout the years and they changed in different competitions, but here are some of them. So for example, running, jumping, javelin throwing, discus throwing, and wrestling. And the athletes would compete in all of these different sports, but that would all be combined within the pentathlon. So let's talk about some of these disciplines because they in themselves were sports. The athletes didn't have to compete in these disciplines as a part of a pentathlon, but they could also compete in them as like a separate sport. So let's start with running, which is probably the most basic one. So as with modern running, there are 2 types of running. So there is short distance running and there is long distance running, and of course these vary in different ranges. An interesting point that I can make here is that modern marathon running has its origin obviously from ancient Greece. So a marathon is a race in a distance of 32 kilometers. And it's very interesting where this comes from. So if you've watched my documentary about the Greco-Persian Wars, I made a video about the Battle of Marathon, which is where the sport originates from. So basically during the first Persian invasion of Greece, the Greeks fought and repelled the Persians at a place which was called Marathon, which was 32 kilometers away from Athens. So they basically sallied out of their city and they contested the Persian landing in Marathon at this place which was 32 kilometers away from Athens. And so after the battle, the Greeks were on foot and the Persians had their ships. So the Persians retreated back to their ships, and both sides, so the Greeks realized that the Persians have an advantage in terms of speed when it comes to their ships, and they could try to go to Athens and take the city before the Greeks could return because they were on foot. And so this was kind of a race as to who was going to get to Athens first. And of course, the Athenians made it, and they made it before the Persian ships. And so this is where this discipline originates from, and that's why a marathon is 32 kilometers. It comes from this ancient battle of the Athenians against the Persians. Anyway, another point to make is that you would think that if someone is a runner, they can do long distance running and short distance running, which is not the case. And in particular, if you look at athletes who are marathon runners and athletes who are short distance runners, if you just look at their physiques, they look quite different. And that is because those 2 sports, while they might seem similar, they actually require a very different athletic skill set to be successful in. So long distance running is all about endurance. And so when you look at, marathon runners, for example, they're quite a bit skinnier. They're very lean, but they also don't have a lot of muscle mass. Whereas if you look at marathon runners, they're still lean. They still don't have a lot of fat on their body. They barely have any, in fact, but they have a little bit more muscle mass because short distance running is ultimately a competition in explosiveness, which explosiveness in a way is complementary to strength because it's not about endurance. If you have to run like 100 meters, you can't really get too tired from that distance, so it's all about it's not a test of who has the best endurance, but it's rather a test of who has the best explosiveness. But that's a little bit of a side tangent, so let's go back to some of the other sports. Another one was jumping. So jumping, obviously you have 2 different types of jumping. You have the high jump and you have the long jump. Now, in my research, I couldn't really find much about high jumping. I don't know if that was like an actual discipline in ancient Greece, or if that originates from like a later period or another part of the world. But long jumping originates from ancient Greece, so it was basically the same concept as the modern Olympic sport of long jumping, with the only difference being that in ancient Greece, the athletes actually held metal weights into their arms so that they could use them and create more momentum so they could travel a longer distance, which is not the case with modern long jumping, but otherwise it's a sport that has pretty much the same, rule set. It's pretty much the same concept. Then you have the two throwing sports, which are javelin throwing and discus throwing. And a point about javelin throwing that I wanted to make is that I remember when I was a kid, it was a really weird sport to me. I remember watching the Olympics when I was very young, and I looked at the javelin throw, and it was a very weird sport to me, because it's like we don't throw javelins anymore. That's not like a weapon that is used in modern warfare. But when you think about it, it was precisely this ancient Greek tradition which keeps the sport alive, because it was a part of the ancient Olympics. So it is this tradition of it being an Olympic sport which still keeps it alive. And then the other one is the discus throw, which is another throwing kind of sport. For this one, I was a little bit curious as to why the discus was chosen as the shape. Obviously a discus, it's like a very aerodynamic shape, so you can throw it further. But why a discus? And then when I did my research for this video, I read that there was some kind of a hypothesis. I don't know if this is confirmed or not, but it is believed that the discus throw evolved from basically people throwing rocks. So picking up a rock and trying to throw it the furthest. But over time, they realized that there are, more shapes. There are shapes that are more aerodynamic. And over time, they realized that with a rock, because the shape is different every time, and it's not really made to be aerodynamic and thrown a further distance. Over time, they started creating, different shapes out of different materials, so that athletes can be so that athletes can throw them further. I don't know how many people actually know this, but in essence, these sports are strength sports, because throwing a javelin, the farthest distance you possibly can, that's ultimately a test of strength. Obviously, technique is important, but technique is important in any kind of strength sport. And something that also a lot of people don't realize is that, I assume it was similar in the ancient world, but I know for a fact in the modern world, a lot of these athletes that are javelin throwers, for example, or discus throwers, which are, those are still sports in the modern Olympics. Those guys don't just go to a field and they start throwing javelins. That's not how they train. That's a part of their training, of course, because they want to perfect their technique. But when it comes to building their strength, they train through more conventional means. They lift weights. They try to train for hypertrophy, or getting their muscles bigger, building more muscle mass. So it's not really as simple as people think it is. And I'm sure that many modern methods of training for these sports have their roots back in ancient Greece, which is really fascinating if you think about it. And finally, we have the last category of sport, which were combat sports or contact sports. So there are three main ones. There is wrestling, there is boxing, and then there is the pankration. So let's start with boxing, because that's the simplest one, I guess. So modern boxing and ancient boxing, I guess the rules weren't that much different, with the exception that the ancient version of it was in all likelihood more violent, which I'm gonna talk about violence a little bit later, but let's explain why it was more violent. So for all of these ancient forms of combat sports, they didn't have a lot of the modern concepts that we have nowadays, such as, different rounds, such as judges, and having some kind of a time limit for the fight. In fact, in all of these sports, fights were basically fought until one of the two athletes could not continue. So essentially, until a knockout or a submission, or until one of the two athletes is in like a very bad shape. Also, another factor which made ancient boxing more violent than modern boxing is that boxing gloves are very much a modern thing. And in the ancient world, obviously they didn't have boxing gloves, so instead what they did is they wrapped leather straps over their hands, which, as we can safely assume, caused way more cuts, so fights were probably quite a bit bloodier than modern boxing. And here's another kind of a misconception about boxing and combat sports. While the ancient version of it might have been more violent in terms of just cuts and blood and that kind of stuff, it might have been safer in some regards as well. So modern boxing gloves are not made for the protection of the athlete who is getting hit. They're not made for the protection of the head that is receiving the blow, but instead they're made for the protection of the fighter who is punching. And in fact, it is much easier to knock someone out with a bare fist than it is with while wearing boxing gloves. And in fact, while boxing is not the most violent combat sport nowadays, it's probably the most dangerous because boxers wear the biggest gloves, which have the most cushion, and the more cushion that there is, the more damage that the fighter can take to the head before being knocked out. So in that regard, in terms of knocking people out, wearing those kinds of straps might have been actually safer. Next is the wrestling, and as far as I understand, I didn't do super deep research on that, but as far as I understand, we don't actually know the rules of Greco-Roman wrestling. Of the ancient wrestling that the Greeks did. And nowadays we have a sport which is called Greco-Roman wrestling, but as far as I understand, the rules are quite different from the rules that they had in the ancient world. And we don't actually know what these rules are, but it is probably pretty safe to assume that it was more violent and in general, a more dangerous sport than modern wrestling. Pankration is an interesting one because, again, there is a modern sport which is also called pankration, but again, as far as I understand, the rule set is completely different. And I don't actually understand what the difference is between pankration and MMA. I don't know what the difference is. I'm familiar with MMA, but I'm not familiar with pankration. But nevertheless, that is a sport which, again, has its roots in ancient Greece. But to summarize it, it was a mixture of wrestling and boxing. So that was the ultimate test of who the best fighter is. So it was a combination of striking and grappling. So I would assume the most similar sport that we can compare it to nowadays is MMA. And if we talk about sports that were added later, after the Roman conquest of Greece, they added equestrian events, including horses, which were part of the Roman tradition. They were more popular in Rome, and of course gladiatorial fights. Here's an interesting case that I'm going to discuss briefly. So after the Romans conquered Greece, there were several attempts to move the Olympic Games to Rome. But in particular, there was 1 year in which the Olympic Games were a complete farcical, and that was during the reign of Nero. And Nero is one of those Roman emperors who was pretty much universally regarded as, someone who must have been some kind of a psychopath, someone who was not very popular in the least. Nero saw himself as an athlete, and he was someone who was very adamant about being an athlete, and he wanted to compete in different sports. And I believe that he is the only emperor who actually competed in the Olympics, but of course this was a huge scandal because since it was the emperor competing, obviously all of those events were fixed, which went totally against the Greek values, and the Greeks were absolutely outraged by it. Not only that, but he also added a bunch of events which had never been a part of the Olympics, and they were not even related to what is traditionally considered to be a sport, but they were more like artistic events such as singing, and of course he won all of them. However, after the death of Nero, he was stripped of all of his Olympic titles, and so I guess there was some kind of a redemption at the end. Okay, so now that we've summarized the ancient Olympics and some of the sports in the ancient world, and I'm also going to talk about gladiatorial fighting, which is not really related to ancient Greece, but I'm also going to talk about that in my in this next part of the video. But I want to talk about the difference in attitude towards sports of ancient people and how sports are seen nowadays. So in the ancient world, there was unquestionably a spiritual element to sports. And to give you a little bit of evidence for that, so for example, the Olympics were not just a sports event, but they were a religious festival. And sports events were always held during religious festivals, which shows that in the eyes of the ancient Greece, there was this connection between sports and spirituality. And here's also the part where I want to mention gladiatorial combat. The Romans had pretty much the same attitude towards their sports, which for all intents and purposes, gladiatorial combat was a sport. Nowadays we don't really have a sport which is a descendant of it, because it is perceived to be something way too violent to be a sport, which again I'll talk about it in a little bit. But it was kind of the same for the Romans. It wasn't just two people competing in the arena, but there was definitely a spiritual element to it. And in fact, it is disputed nowadays where gladiatorial combat originated, but it didn't originate from the Romans. They took it from one of the other Italic cultures which existed before all of Italy was essentially Roman. In particular, one of the cultures which is believed to be the originator of gladiatorial combat is the Etruscan culture. And the Etruscans definitely had a gladiator tradition in their culture. However, before gladiatorial fights became like a spectacle, and before they were fought in an arena, they were fought during burials of influential people. And of course, during burials, you have all kinds of religious ceremonies. So the fact that those fights were fought during burials, that means that gladiatorial combat was some kind of a religious ceremony as well. And also, this is probably the reason why the Greeks were so outraged when Nero wanted to compete in the Olympics. It was because that kind of destruction of the original traditions of the Olympics, it was probably seen as sacrilege, which is why they took it so seriously. And this is where I want to compare it to modern sports. So obviously modern sports are not as highly regarded, and athletes are not as respected as they were in the ancient world, because in our modern culture we no longer have this association of sport and spirituality. Sports nowadays are seen as purely entertainment, and I'm sure that the Greeks and the Romans also viewed sport as a form of entertainment. We can safely assume that, but that's the difference. There was also this higher element to it. It wasn't just entertainment, but there was more to it, which is why I would argue they were more serious about sport than people are nowadays. And also another point that I want to make that is related to this is that I kind of view sport as an extension of war. And I also believe that this is why, again, ancient people took it so seriously. So let me elaborate a little bit. If you think about the similarities between sport and war, you can find quite a few of them. For example, the behavior. During sport, you have a lot of warlike behaviors. You try to dominate your opponent. You have to control your aggression. You have to have a clear strategy for winning. You have to train for it. And in a lot of cases, the better athlete was also the better warrior. So if you think about the similarities between sport and war, they're really endless. So ultimately, both of them are forms of competitions. The only difference is in the rule set in which it happens, because in war there's pretty much no rule set, whereas in a sport there is a rule set. And there is also another important difference, is that sports competitions are always consensual. Athletes want to participate in them, whereas with wars it's a little bit more complicated than that. It's not necessarily consensual. But this aspect of sport, the fact that it is agreed upon, these athletes could compete within a predetermined rule set, I think that is also one of the reasons why sport was viewed as this more civilized thing, as opposed to war, which was more barbaric, because it didn't have any rules, because it was more chaotic. And finally, I want to talk about another difference between modern sports and ancient sports that I think is pretty significant, but I think that most people don't know that it actually exists. If you went to Olympia in the 5th century BC and you wanted to see the Olympic Games, I'm sure that as a modern person, you would be somewhat shocked by the fact that the ancient athletes competed completely naked. Okay, so why was that? In the minds of the ancient Greeks, it was important for an athlete to be naked because the body of an athlete was essentially the epitome of athleticism. It was the visualization of athletic ability, and so athletes had to display their athletic ability by doing stuff, but their body was also a way to kind of visualize that ability. And in ancient Greece, there was also a lot of talk about the aesthetics of the body. What is an aesthetic body? And while our perceptions of nudity and a lot of our social norms are different in our society, compared to the ancient Greeks, when it comes to aesthetics, a lot of what we consider to be aesthetic in the West actually comes from ancient Greece. Because if you think about it, all of those statues of athletes and heroes and different characters from Greek mythology that we see that have survived until nowadays, they're still considered to be highly aesthetic. What the ancient Greeks considered to be the perfect male body is still considered to be something that is very visually appealing. However, I want to talk about a drastic difference in our understanding that I want to clarify, and this is not directly related to sports. It's more of a broader point, but it is very important to me to bring it up. So over the years, and I've fallen into this misconception before myself, but over the years, I've heard a lot of people claim that basically ancient Greece was this haven for homosexuality, that it was essentially totally normal for men to be attracted to men in like a sexual way. And I believe that this originates from Plato in particular, and a discussion about aesthetics and what a beautiful body is. And so there was this widespread view, allegedly, among ancient Greeks that the male body was more beautiful than the female body, and that a male's body is meant to be appreciated, and that that's why the athletes competed naked, so that the audience, they could look at their physique and appreciate their body. However, people who take this fascination and appreciation of the male body by the ancient Greeks, which obviously in ancient Greece was a very male-dominated culture, but this kind of fascination with the male body, I think that people who insert some kind of a sexual element to it, I think they're very disingenuous, because essentially what they're saying is they say that the ancient Greeks perceived the male body to be more beautiful than the female body, so therefore Greek men had sex with other men for pleasure, and they had sex with women for reproduction. And I've heard this from many people over the years, and again, as I said, this is a misconception that I have myself fallen into. And I think that there is quite a bit of evidence that homosexuality and bisexuality and whatever, it wasn't really accepted in the ancient world. I think there is plenty of evidence for that, which I'm not gonna get into in this video because I'm gonna go way off topic. But I believe that this is not an accurate representation of how the ancient Greeks thought, because I think that they had this very clear separation between platonic love and erotic love. And you would hear a lot of Greeks talk about their friends, their male friends, how they love them, and all many things that we in our modern minds, they look, we imply this kind of sexual element to them. But I don't think that there is any of that in the case with the ancient Greeks. And I think that this difference in culture comes from the fact that the ancient Greeks were obviously a pre-Christian culture. So for example, in the Abrahamic religions, there is this clear association of nudity with like sexual desire. This is why, for example, Muslims, they encourage their women to cover up and to not show certain body parts, and that was the case with early Christianity as well. And this is where this modern perception that nudity is necessarily associated with sexuality in some way, comes from. And I think that to the ancient Greeks, this kind of concept would have been totally foreign. And I think that, in their view, a man could appreciate another man's body purely from an aesthetic point of view, and there would be nothing sexual about it. And if you think about it, this is also true for a lot of other European pre-Christian cultures as well. I don't know if this can be like corroborated with like a study or whatever, but I think that in a lot of countries where Christianity never had like a super firm grasp on people's values. So for example, if you look at the Nordic countries, which of course are countries which Christianized in the Middle Ages, but they were never, super religious as like culturally. And I think that those are the cultures where people are more comfortable with nudity. And if you go to those countries and talk to people, you're going to see a lot of people who have the same concept, that nudity is not necessarily associated with like eroticism. However, to further reinforce this point, that the ancient Greeks viewed the male body as like beautiful and something that should be appreciated, and the female body, they didn't view it in the same way. So there were some female athletes who also competed. So for females, the conditions were a little bit different. Females weren't necessarily encouraged to be athletes. However, physical fitness, I believe, was also, they were also encouraged to learn the way of physical fitness. So let's go a little bit back. In ancient Greece, boys and girls were educated in very different ways. They both received education, but they were educated in different fields. So, for example, boys were educated in philosophy, military strategy, stuff like that. Whereas for girls, they were educated on different subjects that are considered to be more traditionally feminine. However, not to go too far off topic, there were female athletes who also competed in sports. However, the key difference is that they didn't compete naked, and they had different rules for how they need to cover their body. And in fact, when the ancient Greeks worked out, they practiced some kind of a sport when it wasn't necessarily competitive, but it was more about just exercising. Obviously, the men and the women, they worked out separately. The men, it was totally normal for them to train naked, while for women it would have been seen as something outrageous for a woman to train naked. And I think that this further reinforces this kind of position, that there was nothing sexual about it. It was just that they had different view of aesthetics at the time, and it's just a cultural thing. It's not really a sexual thing. And I think that people who claim this either misunderstand Greek concepts, pre-Christian Greek concepts, or they're just disingenuous and they try to push some kind of a political narrative, which unfortunately happens quite a bit nowadays. But without going too far off topic, I think that that's everything that I wanted to talk about today, and that's going to be it for this video. I hope you enjoyed it. As you know, any kind of feedback is appreciated, so if you want to add anything or just give any kind of constructive criticism, it's always welcome. I read all of my comments and I try to reply to all of them. So any kind of comment will be appreciated. That is going to be it, and I'll see you next time. Goodbye.